Hello, and welcome back to Bossing Brain Surgery with Mr. F, the how-to guide for DIY lobotomies. Just kidding. Welcome back to Bossing English with Mr. F. Today we'll be looking at GCSE Power and Conflict Anthology, specifically this question: compare the way poets present the power of ideas in Kamikaze by Beatrice Garland and in one other poem from Power and Conflict. I'll be comparing it to Bayonet Charge by Ted Hughes. However, other suitable poems that discuss the power of ideas could be Checking Out Me History, London, Ozymandias. There may be more, Poppies maybe as well. Okay, let's crack on. As always, I derived the meaning from the question, because obviously poems have multiple meanings, and with the question they want you to focus on a specific thing. And every time I look at language, structure, form, or context, I'll be returning to the meaning of both poems so that I'm always answering the question and hopefully producing a well-developed, well-structured answer. Okay, we'll start with language in Kamikaze. The opening stanza is packed with the ideological Japanese symbols that convinced the daughter's father, the persona is the daughter speaking about her father, so that the things that convinced him to become a kamikaze pilot. So we have sunrise, links to Land of the Rising Sun, samurai sword, there's a hint of violence there, the shaven head maybe suggests subservience to powerful ideals, powerful incantations, these will be the political slogans of Imperial Japan. And what you'll notice there is that there is sibilance, which may be suggestive of their malign influence, the symbol's malign influence on the father. Later, more potent natural symbols of Japan emerge in semantic fields of fish and fishing, also the sea, with sibilants used to mimic the sea sounds, like in the turbulent inrush of breakers or safe to the shore, salt-sodden awash. But this is sometimes still tainted with the dark ideological associations of the war, like a huge flag, or they're somehow menacing, such as dark shoals, black crabs, the dark prince tuna, which is muscular and dangerous. So the key question here for you to think about is that that tuna, a danger to whom? The pilot flying above, or to the imperial ideology of fighting to the death? One for you to ponder. Poem B. This is similar to Bayonet Charge in that there is a similar enlightening of a soldier about the futile ideals that lead them to war, or led them to war. At the start of Bayonet Charge, his eyes brimmed with a patriotic tear in the opening stanza. Then the soldier sees himself in the second stanza from a cosmic perspective, the cold clockwork of stars and nations that led him to war. By the end of the poem, in the final stanza, there's an asyndetic list of abandoned ideals: king, honor, human dignity, etc. And that's a very brutal etc., isn't it? Now, which have been, using the simile, dropped like luxuries as the flight or fight instinct kicks in and flight has won. What's different is this is all about self-preservation. We are not given a daughter's perspective on this change of heart, but a dispassionate speaker's perspective. We'll come to that later. The he is nameless. He's just another grunt, just another soldier. The point I'm making here is a language point, but it's also structural because I'm talking about changes from the beginning of the poem to the end of the poem in both of those poems. So bear that in mind. Sometimes there's an overlap between the two. Okay, moving on to more structural points to do with persona or speaker of the poem. In Kamikaze, the poem's female speaker allows an original perspective on the typically male-centric world of war. The daughter-father dynamic further complicates this narrative of national and personal history, of national and familial shame. It is a sort of imaginative remembrance or thought experiment. She seeks to justify her father's change of heart. The use of italics allows her to sometimes interrupt her narrative naturally, when she says, yes, grandfather's boat, because it would be their grandfather's, her grandfather's boat. As if recounting it to her own children, we witness the difficult story continue to be told and to take on a life of its own. Now, a really interesting question here for you to consider is, Whose shame is greater? Is the father's shame about returning back from his kamikaze mission greater, or actually is it the daughter? Is she ashamed of how she treated her father and followed the mother, the father's husband, in ignoring him and becoming silent and disowning him? Okay, one for you to ponder. Poem B. This is different to Bayonet Charge in that the speaker seems to recount the soldier's crisis of conscience in a disinterested way. He's clearly not as invested as a daughter coming to terms with her father's shame, and indeed her own. The heavy use of caesura mimic the hesitant, stumbling ideals of the soldier as doubts creep in. But at times in Bayonet Charge, this feels more like a war journalist's recounting of a moment he witnessed, with the similes and sensual details sweat heavy. At times, it feels almost reimagined, which would be similar to Kamikaze, as the daughter tries to justify the father's shameful act through wishful thinking. He must have, and she imagines how he must have looked down, seen all these beautiful Japanese natural imagery and the fishing, and be turned back by this vision. But it's her interpretation of events. He must have is a modal verb. She's imagining this. We also get the same God's eye perspective in both, one from the warplane and two from the cosmic cold clockwork of fate, and both culminate in an interaction with nature, the fish in Kamikaze, the hare in Bayonet Charge, that seems epiphanic. Bayonet Charge ends with potentially explosive touchy dynamite of the terror of the soldier, perhaps the locking in of future PTSD, whilst Kamikaze ends with her father's metaphorical and paradoxical social death that occurred precisely because he chose to live. In Kamikaze, the use of the third-person narrative allows us to hear the difficulties of the daughter recounting this traumatic history of her father to her own children, a transmission of trauma and maybe an instance of revisionism, rewriting history. In Poem B, both poems use free verse, perhaps as both are seeking to free themselves from rigid ideological positions of patriotism. Bayonet Charge's 8-7-8 line length, that's for the different stanzas, perhaps showing us his out-of-step thought process from other soldiers following the patriotic ideals. So maybe what happens in the second stanza, which has shorter number of lines, is why he's out of step. Whereas Kamikaze's rigid 6-line stanzas could show how regimented Japanese life is, and the fact that it's still restricted in its ability or inability to deal with its imperial war past. Both use enjambment to mimic the untethered minds we are dealing with of the two soldiers. In Kamikaze, the pilot flies free of restrictive ideologies, at least in her daughter's imagined view of things. Okay, coming on to context. Beatrice Garland's poem is a thought experiment about radicalization and ideological extremism that was inspired by what could drive people to commit the September the 11th attacks in New York in 2001. There's a brilliant interview with Mr. Bruff. I will post the link to that in the description, and I thoroughly recommend you listen to the poet speaking about her poem and her inspiration for it. Ted Hughes was an interwar child, so was caught between the two world wars of the 20th century. His father served in the Lancashire Fusiliers in World War I, fighting in Gallipoli in France. He never really spoke about the war, and there's an article that I will link to, and you can find out a bit more about Hughes's interactions with his father on this. Hughes's hometown of the Calder Valley experienced much loss as a result of this war, as many young men joined PALS battalions to fight and became casualties of war. So Hughes would have experienced that kind of absence, that present absence of young men. He wrote, this is from his own notes, "The big, ever-present, overshadowing thing was the First World War, in which my father and my uncles fought, and which seemed to have killed every other young man my relatives had known." This comes from a brilliant British library connecting Hughes's poetry to the war/wars. I will link that in the description, and I recommend you read it because there's more information and more contextual information to be gathered there about Hughes and why he wrote Bayonet Charge. Hopefully that has been useful for you. Smash that subscribe button, do something lovely to the like button, and I will be back with more felicity anon. Bye for now.